This is a string of 4 digits. This is so basic. You might as well censor the word hi. You might as well censor HI.
But also it's to chill speech, right? It's so people will self-censor.
Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
I did want to say before we start, for the second question, please don't do the Morse code like beeping.
Okay, I won't.
I'll explain why, but I can explain why now or during the podcast proper. It's up to you. But
Sure, I'm interested to hear, really. Go for it.
Okay, so the issue is that because Comey had the charges presented to a grand jury and they returned an indictment, that means that there's a question of controversy right now over that specific string of numbers. And so it enters into that territory it's a gray area between whether it's free speech, which is protected speech, or if it's not protected speech, which puts us at risk, right? Because Comey was being prosecuted for something on social media, and this constitutes the same kind of thing. It's social media.
All right, it's adjacent to social media, sure.
It is social media, right? Because it goes out to a public audience, and that's social, right? That it's media and it's social. And so that's the whole concern I have there. Is just actually, I wrote it down. Have you ever heard of Murphy's Law or Finagle's Law? Do you know what those?
I've heard of Murphy's Law. What's the other one?
So Finagle's Law is just a worst version of that. So it's if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong at the worst possible moment, right?
Oh.
It's bad things will happen, but at the most unexpected time. And so the point here is just if you know that something's tempting fate, don't tempt fate.
Sure. Yeah, and it does fit into our brand of generally being, one way of putting it is risk averse, but another way of putting it is we see all of what's going on in terms of who gets fame on social media, and it is what would have in previous years been described as the infamous. Not exclusively, but unfortunately, the infamy has a has a big amplification mechanism built into it in the internet, as we may see in our story about NBA violence, violence tangential to the NBA.
But it also carries a great risk, right? With great risk comes with the potential of great costs, right? Lawsuits and fines and lawyer fees.
Sure. So, I guess we're talking about the second story, so we might as well start there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can start there if you want.
Yeah. So the intro of the topic is that NBC reported last week that somebody, probably not James Comey, spelled out on the grass the digits, quote, 8647, unquote. And this, you probably know more about the James Comey thing. Why don't you launch with that?
So the issue, I've been listening to a lot of interviews about that and discussions regarding the James Comey thing. And the issue there is that there's an argument to be made that he's facing what's called selective prosecution, meaning that he's being singled out for a phrase that's been used in various contexts of the numbers 8647, where right now it looks to me as a lay observer that the Trump administration is trying to find ways to prosecute James Comey. And so they tried to prosecute him in a variety of ways. The ways that we've talked about before were over different issues, and those prosecutions failed because the argument went that the U.S. attorney who'd been appointed had been appointed not according to the law, and so the charges had to be thrown out because the U.S. attorney at the time couldn't bring those charges because they weren't actually considered a legitimate person to bring those charges in that context, because there was a process to replace the U.S. attorney there that had to involve the judicial system itself. They needed a panel of judges to put in a judge. It couldn't just be Trump putting in a judge. That was the issue there. And those were different charges. And so when that failed, the Trump administration then tried a different avenue. And that different avenue was to try and charge Comey Oh, the first time around, they tried to charge him for perjury in a congressional committee hearing. They said that he lied about something related to a statement he made. But anyways, that's a whole different thing. But in this current iteration, they brought charges to a grand jury trying to allege that Comey made a violent threat with a social media post of a bunch of shells arranged in the numbers 647. And they're trying to push what I would call a novel theory that those numbers represented a threat of violence against the sitting president, which is a crime, is the allegation. And and the issue for the Comey case right now, from my perspective, is that Comey acknowledged the possibility that it might be viewed as violence rhetoric
Oh,
because he removed the post from social media. That's the issue here. The reason he got
oh,
prosecuted is that he was told this might be viewed as violent. Then he said, I publicly, I'm not actually gonna, I need to be careful here on what he said publicly, but effectively what happened in the timeline of events was this post goes up. There's a whole bunch of responses that are critical of the post. The post gets removed. Comey gets contacted by the authorities. I'm putting that in quotes, but essentially Comey gets contacted, makes something to the effect of a public statement that he doesn't endorse violence and therefore remove the post because it might have been perceived that way. Then the media at that time, which this was a while, this was months and months ago. We're talking like almost a year ago. At that time, everyone goes, okay, nothing to see here, right? Comey removed the post. He acknowledged that it could be perceived as like a bad statement. Everyone moved on. Nope. It turns out that the Trump administration had been spending months and months investigating this and then decided to prosecute Comey on this specific thing for that window of time where Comey acknowledged that it could have been perceived as a violent threat. It was the acknowledgement part in my mind where they had what looks like it could be not a credible argument, that there's a possibility of an argument that it's more than, it's not free speech, that it's not protected speech because of the fact that it was acknowledged that it could have been interpreted as violent. That's where how things work semantically for words is that language is fluid, right? How we understand things isn't fixed in time. It's not a static thing. It evolves, is shaped by how we make meaning of things. And so in this particular case, it sure looks like the Trump administration is trying to make more of this statement than how it's been viewed at times in the past in other contexts. So the context most cited that I've heard of was in the restaurant industry, that it means just to ban someone from the premises, to kick them out of a restaurant.
yeah,
Or the other example is actually that they're just out of something, that they've run out of some kind of product, and so you have to remove it from the menu, right? Because say you're selling steak with potatoes, but you're out of potatoes or you're out of steak, right? For whatever reason.
yeah. Or there's a problem with the steak. So they're like, oh, there was a problem with that item, so we 86'd it. It's like we're done with that.
Yes, but
Yeah,
the whole issue here right now for why it's
yeah,
controversial and it's risky to say these words, these numbers in any context right now, is that it's not about necessarily the intent of the person saying it. It's about how the message is received or interpreted by other audiences. Because the whole problem with language, not problem, but the whole way that language works is that a person can say something meaning something else, but
yeah,
it can still be interpreted in a different way. And that interpretation, depending on how it's adjudicated in our marketplace of ideas, right? Because people have discussions and debates. This goes way back. So look at religious debates that have occurred over the meaning of, I don't want to get really into the issues of doctrinal differences in different religions, but there have been some really long standing debates over the meaning of words, how they were said, when they were said, the context in which they were said, to whom they were said. And so where it becomes really tricky is that the threat doesn't necessarily have to be credible for it to be perceived as a threat. That's the issue. That it can be viewed as a rallying call. And where I know this gets a little fuzzy and it seems like a gray area, but where it gets really problematic in terms of language is that it can be viewed as a terroristic threat, a call to political violence and to engage in a political movement. That's where the issue arises. And we can actually go through a list of a couple of phrases that are really problematic. Actually, the phrase kicking to the curb, that can have a connotation of violence. Have you ever seen the movie American History X?
Actually, I haven't. I should see that one. That's a pretty seminal work.
Yeah, it's the one I immediately thought of when I saw that phrase because kicking to the curb is a violent act in that movie. The term
Oh,
is curb stomping. The point is that a phrase that could seem benign or
yeah.
meaningless, you could think that's just like a turn of phrase or a common adage or like this normal kind of statement that someone makes can be interpreted, right,
Yeah.
in a violent way. And so that's the issue here with a couple of these phrases is that one is the 8647 right now is being interpreted in a very, I'm going to say that it will be adjudicated obviously in court, and Comey's got an argument to make that obviously intent does matter, right? That like he clearly demonstrated that there was no motive there by removing the post, acknowledging that
Yeah.
he abhors violence and that nonviolence is the only way to engage in peaceful protests and democratic change, that nonviolence is what we should be aspiring to, because if you want to affect social change, you need to do it through something like the democratic process, right? Through you put your ideas forth through propositions or you elect candidates and then they debate out those issues and make laws and make change, because the other types of of change are very dangerous, right? They can lead to chaos and anarchy and all sorts of unintended consequences that we as a society generally don't value as worth pursuing. But anyways,
Sure.
the point I'm making is that phrases that seem benign may not be interpreted as benign. And it's about the interpretation that really matters here, because in this specific context, the prosecutors are deciding whether something rises to that level of being worth prosecuting. And it really looks like to me, again, as a lay observer, but one with a degree in political science, that the Trump administration is trying to look for ways to diminish the political opponents and rivals of Trump by coming up with novel ways to prosecute them. So one way that they've tried to do that was to go after their mortgage documents. That was the whole controversy with the recently appointed acting DNI who just had his appointment revoked. The whole
What's DNI for our viewers?
So the DNI is the top intelligence official. It was created after 9/11 because the issue with 9/11, if you read the commission report, one of the issues was that there was a lack of cooperation between the various competing intelligence agencies. So they had the puzzle pieces to put together what was about to happen, and the warnings and the alarm bells were ringing. But what they didn't have was the different groups telling each other that they had the puzzle pieces. So one group had information that there were people taking pilot lessons without learning how to land. Another knew that one of the people was on a list of potentially. There's a whole documentary about it that's worth watching. The Looming Tower, I think, about the various avenues that they were chasing to try and figure out what was about to happen and the threats that existed. So what the DNI is, it's the Director of National Intelligence. They oversee all 18 of the intelligence agencies. What they do is they collate the data, they get all the various information together, and then they present a risk assessment to Congress every year. That's the thing that happened where Tulsi Gabbard went up in front of Congress and they asked her, "Did you warn the president about Iran? What do you really think about Iran?" And there's a whole, if you want to understand the exchange there, that was really important. Ossoff from Georgia, I think is his name, got into a really long, protracted debate with Gabbard about how it was her role to warn of the actual threats, that it wasn't up to the president alone to say this is a threat or this is a credible threat, that it was actually her statutory role to say expressly this is a threat or this isn't a threat, that what they're talking about in this context isn't as bad as they're saying it is, because the role isn't just to serve the president, it's to serve the American people, right? And that's the
Yeah.
legislative branch too, that's Congress. It's how it's interpreted, right? Context matters heavily, right? So the terrorism, how it's defined, it varies, but one of the key facets of terrorism is advocating for the use of political violence to achieve political ends. It's essentially advocating to use some kind of violent act to accomplish some kind of change within society or the government, right? And to use fear as a way to do that. And so, in the context of Comey, where essentially he posted this picture showing this phrase, it could have been interpreted as advocating for the violent removal of Trump from office. Because in one context, as I mentioned, for 86 487 or for 86ing someone from an establishment, it means physically throwing them out, right? Like with a bouncer,
Sure.
which could be perceived as a kind of violence, right? That's part of
Yeah.
the issue. That's the whole. That's the whole. Ever heard the phrase "making a mountain out of a molehill"?
Yes, definitely.
What they're doing is they're trying to find like the tiniest little sliver of a possible credible thing of and making and bringing it way out of proportion, because the strategy seems to be not necessarily to actually prosecute and put Comey in jail, but it's just to make it really expensive for him to just go about his life, because all these different court cases cost a lot of money. It's the same deal with Letitia James and with a couple of the other ones. It's not necessarily the case that like the end goal is them in jail or them fined or them out of a job. That would be great, I'm sure, from the eyes of the people going after them in terms of the prosecutions. The idea is to punish them in a similar way to how Trump was punished during the Biden administration, because he had to keep defending himself from a variety of different legal cases, right? The classified documents case, the January 6th case, all the different investigations from the special prosecutor. Those all cost money, a lot of money and time, right? Do you remember in one of those cases in New York, he had a gag order and he was required essentially to stay in New York for the duration of the trial? And so essentially what he's doing is he's going after the various people that made his life uncomfortable, right? And he's making their life uncomfortable because he's got the power to do it right now. And who really is gonna restrict that particular exercise of power? Congress? No. Congress.
They've shown that they won't.
And the Supreme Court already said that Trump's immune from political process.
The current Congress, anyway.
Yeah, the current Congress. And the Supreme Court essentially said that Trump's immune from criminal prosecution if he can state that it was an official presidential act. Well, technically, the president's the top law enforcement person in the country. And so if there's the possibility of a crime, he can technically order his attorneys and any of the U.S. attorney's offices to prosecute people, right? Anybody who has broken the law. And in this particular circumstance, the interpretation of whether the law was broken is super gray, right? It's a very gray area. The reason it's in court and that he's not just in jail is that there is a debate, right? That there is controversy, and it has to be adjudicated in court, right? That there has to be a more final say in a courtroom, in a court of law, in a actual case where he can prove his innocence, right? It's not a done deal that Comey's just going to go to jail. There's a variety of strategies, I'm sure, that they're exploring. One is this selective prosecution thing. He's the only person so far, as far as I can tell, that's been singled out for this particular phrase in terms of being prosecuted in this way. So he could say, well, they plucked me out of all the people in the whole country and are prosecuting me just for this.
Because a lot of people are saying those digits.
Yeah, and that's where the big issue arises. If this is the real the real threat that they're claiming, then in theory they should be prosecuting way more people, right? The people who are selling the shirts, the people who are using the
Don't do that, but if it is the case.
Yeah, that's the argument as far as I can see. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a lay observer, right? This is just me expressing my opinion about some of the avenues I see for arguing against the prosecution. Is that if what they're saying was really the case, right, that it was a threat of actual violence, then there needs to be way more examples of it being used in that specific context, because it's very unclear if that phrase has ever actually been used in the English language in that way. They're saying it's been used in that way, but the evidentiary record it isn't quite there as far as I can tell. But again, I'm not a lawyer. There could very well be a circumstance, and this is why these things need to be adjudicated. Is there very well could
Uh-huh.
be a circumstance in history where those specific numbers or that phrase has been used in some kind of context that could be perceived as actual violence. That's where it's complicated
Sure.
and where it gets fuzzy. But in terms of in terms of the things that seem benign, the definition of terrorism is fuzzy. Governments
Right.
define what terrorism is, right? That the distinctions that they make in terms of who's a terrorist and who's not is very much in the hands of the government to decide. And at the point that the government decides that somebody is making statements that are terrorism rather than just speech, then it becomes something different. It becomes criminal, and that's where these things get really murky, and it becomes a real gray area. Is because those are the kinds of things that either Congress has to define explicitly, right? They have to write a law that says these words, these phrases, this thing is unequivocally violence, which there's a lot of words in the English language. There's a lot of phrases that would be very time consuming, but that would give clarity to this issue. Otherwise, what we're left with is the ambiguity, and ambiguity is where real problems happen, right? It is when something can be perceived in an ambiguous or uncertain manner because one person may intend simply to make it a protest statement or something, but it can be perceived in a very violent way. So the example that I'm actually thinking of is in a film, The Trial of the it's about the Chicago protests, where they put a bunch of the Chicago protesters of the Democratic Convention, I think in the 60s, on trial for a long time. For like it was a really long trial. But one of the protesters,
Was it 68 then? Because probably.
maybe it's a movie that I saw. Let me see what the name is. The Trial of Sex movie. No, there's a movie that was made, but the particular example I'm thinking of is The Trial of the Chicago 7 in 2020. There's a statement that was made in the movie by Eddie Redmayne's character where he was the leader of the Students for a Democratic Society, where he's being
Oh, okay.
prosecuted because he made a statement that essentially was being perceived as an act of violence. And he explains in the movie, I don't know if this was a real thing, has this explained word for word, that maybe there was some Hollywood fiction that they added some flair to it. But the point is that in the movie, he makes a statement at a rally that gets perceived as violent, and he explains later in the confines of the defense table with the lawyers and the other defendants what he really meant. But his statement was interpreted as violent. He was then prosecuted for that statement and put on trial for a really long time, like a really long trial. And the trial was a whole mess. Some of the lawyers for the trial were held in contempt. The defense attorneys, they're held in contempt of court and thrown in jail themselves and fined. Like it was a whole thing. But the point I'm making is that protesters can make statements or chants or arguments that they think are just protest statements, but they can be perceived as violent and prosecuted. And so that's where in our current era of, I don't know if I'd call it hypervigilance, but our current era of the global war on terror, the way that you can talk about things like free speech or protected speech takes on a bit of a different light because the definition of terrorism is left up to the government in most cases. The reality of the situation is that not all governments have a as charitable a view of what is acceptable free speech compared to other governments. And so the level of severity for prosecuting these kinds of things changes between administrations. So think of flag burning, for example. For a long time, flag burning was a very risky thing. Flag burning is the example I think of in terms of constantly there's a back and forth in American society between whether flag burning is free speech or if it should be prosecuted as a crime. And it's constant, right? Of
Would you need a constitutional amendment for it to be labeled, for it to be against the law? Because I know they were talking about that a lot in the aughts.
no, so this is where it
This is a rabbit hole, sorry.
no, this is where it gets really tricky, right? That the argument goes that there already is a constitutional amendment that allows it. It's the First Amendment, right? That people have a freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. right? Like, there's a bunch of freedoms that people have, but where it gets controversial is the debate on context, right? Of if somebody is just burning a flag, does that constitute violence, or is that them just burning a flag, right? Does there have to be a message associated with it, or is the burning of the flag the message? These are all those things that get really murky, which is why they are adjudicated and why there's constant debates about whether there should be laws to. I mean, it's a whole thing. But the point I'm making is that our current administration is much more not ambitious. They're much more aggressive in prosecuting certain types of expression and speech, especially right now. It looks like there's an effort. It reminds me actually a lot of Nixon, right? Have you ever heard of Nixon's strategy to throw hippies and black people in jail by prosecuting the war on drugs, by going after people who smoke marijuana? That it was a whole strategy to get people to turn into felons so they couldn't vote. Well, one way to get people to not vote is to get them a felony, right? If they are a felon, they are banned from voting in most states. So, how do you do that? One way is to just figure out ways to prosecute more felonies, right? That could, I know it seems maybe this is just free speech and they're just making a mountain out of a molehill, but there could be a whole different thing going on, that they're trying to create a strategy to essentially suppress both the voice and the vote of the most vocal critics of the Trump administration. That this is a test case, essentially. What they're trying to do is to try a variety of strategies to go after the most prominent critics of Trump. And if that works, then they'll just do sweeping prosecutions, right, against pretty much anyone they can find for social media that have made any kind of statements, even in the arena of this, so that they can suppress their vote and their voice, right? Because if somebody can't vote, obviously they have less of an influence on the elections, but also it's to suppress, it's to chill speech, right? It's so people will self censor, that they won't, that they'll limit what they say out of fear of being prosecuted. And that's an old strategy, right? That, look at the Inquisition and the to try and stop people arguing against the Catholic Church and the various sects, that SECTS, the various branches of the religious churches that have engaged in religious wars and to suppress the voices that were loudest. I'm thinking in particular, you've mentioned it before, the Protestant Reformation, right? Of the guy putting the pamphlets on the doors and then having to essentially run away, right? Of America, in part, if you look at its history, is a country of refugees, right? From religious persecution. Same deal here. This is the strange thing. The Trump administration isn't even like shy about talking about this. They are trying to find ways to denaturalize people, to make them no longer citizens. And there's a variety of novel ways they're trying to approach that. One is through people who've committed criminal fraud, right? So who have lied about money and stolen from people. And there's a variety of other ways that they're trying. But right now, in this administration, the numbers are way, way higher. There's been reports I've been reading and articles about this where they're trying to come up with novel ways to make it so people are no longer citizens. Why? Why would you not want someone to be a citizen anymore? At a most basic level, if someone's not a citizen anymore, they can't vote, right? Can't run for office. That's pretty straightforward, right? Like if the Trump administration figures out a way to remove one of the obstacles it sees, which is people who vote against it, then all of a sudden it doesn't take that much math to figure out that the numbers look, the numbers, this is the thing. The numbers right now, just from a basic political science perspective, are not in favor of the Republicans for holding on to power in the future. The base are old and getting older, and the younger generations just don't like what the Republican Party is selling.
Source, Real Clear Politics. Yeah.
I don't know about that, but this is just for me looking at basic numbers of voter turnout in elections, right? That they wouldn't be gerrymandering and they wouldn't be doing all these weird esoteric things if they thought that they were going to win. No, they're doing all this stuff to try and winnow down the voting pool so that they get voters that will vote for them. And it turns out that the demographics of the country are changing, that future generations are not buying what the Republican Party is selling. They're not buying the cruelty. They're not buying the move away from Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare or away from science. Young people have grown up seeing the issues of climate change. And so it's a real tough sell to be like, oh, nothing to see here. There's no massive wildfires, or the ocean's not really rising, or the fossil fuels haven't polluted the air and the water. Nothing to see here. We definitely didn't see Deepwater Horizon with a giant spout of oil leaking into the Gulf of Mexico. Now it's called the Gulf of America.
Oh, watch out. We can't say Gulf of Mexico. We can't say, quote, Gulf of Mexico, unquote.
But the then Gulf of Mexico, we didn't see a massive oil spill with, thousands of barrels of oil spilling out and hitting the animals and the plants and the ocean. That didn't happen, right? We totally didn't see that. The whole point is that you can ignore reality for so long. At some point, right?
Yeah.
It's still gonna happen.
You can ignore it until the water's rising and there's a shortage of water wings. Yeah.
Yeah, if we run out of water, or we run out of food, or at some point we have to do more than nothing, right? And that's where I think the debates of the future are being held right now. And it's an issue too with AI, with these AI data centers, because they're just sucking up a lot of water and a lot of electricity, right? What do we do? But anyways,
there's a moratorium on those in City of Seattle now, or moratorium on new permits. This is an interesting story, but I think it's an important story because it really is about the kind of country that you want to live in. And we can talk, let's just say the ideal tax rate might be 35% or it might be 50%. The ideal tariff rate might be like 5% or it might be like negative 2%. And all of that is important. But an issue like this, it's about the kind of society that you want to live in. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, so the point here that I was trying to make is that these prosecutions against the rivals of Trump aren't just about vengeance, that there is an overarching strategy going on. One way to look at this is that these are all essentially test cases that they're rolling out to see if they work, sort of trial balloons, because if they work in any context for any of these prosecutions, then it creates a new strategy for trying to suppress the speech of the most vocal critics of the Republican Party, but also the Trump administration for the next however many years. That what they'll do is they'll tie these people up in litigation or in court cases, and that would limit their ability to participate fully in the political conversation and marketplace of ideas that we have in the country. That essentially would diminish their power overall in trying to create democratic change in various elections, in various contests around the country. And that this is actually not even a new strategy. I mentioned Nixon because Nixon's the one that came up with a variety of ways to try and limit the ability of people who he thought didn't like him from participating fully in the democratic process. What do you think Watergate was? They were trying to steal the information of the Democratic Party to use that information in a way to reduce the likelihood of the Democrats winning. That's my understanding of what happened there. So this is just a different era of that kind of politicking.
So first of all, let me put my cards on the table, which I have done so many times in many episodes of this podcast. Political violence is dumb. And people who want to, or people who commit it, or let's say would commit it, are in danger of committing it, should be in jail or a mental institution. Because it's just not something that somebody of sound mind would do. Look at Julius Caesar. Look at how much he was revered in Rome after they did that to him. It doesn't make sense. So that is very truly what I believe. Now, taking a step back for this story in general, because, and this is a long segment, so James Comey put up some seashells spelling out 8647, and now the Trump administration is suing him and saying that's a violent threat. This is the perfect test story of the differences in reasoning patterns between Mike and myself. Because the way I think about things is I can reason about this way, and is that wrong or is it not wrong? If it's right, I can reason to this next thing, and is that right, is that wrong? And it's good for me to consult Mike and people like him because he's like, well, here's the historical context, which you are not considering. So this podcast is a collaborative effort between Mike and myself. So when I say this is bogus, I'm not saying this is bogus to Mike. I'm saying this is bogus to those who would prosecute such a thing. But I made this beepy thing, which I won't release, which may or may not spell out 8647. It does not actually spell out 8647, and it's not even in Morse code. But I just won't release it. No problem. But the fact that I have to mind myself about these things really frustrates me. Because let's just talk about it from an information theory perspective, like a mathematics perspective. You can fit, quote, 8647, unquote, into 14 bits of information on a computer. That fits within 2 bytes. Not a megabyte, not a kilobyte, not 10 bytes, 2 bytes. It's like a smaller... You could do it, I don't know which characters they are, and I'm not going to look it up, and I actually don't even know if this is possible, really. But, like, it's 2 characters in typing, more or less. I haven't looked up what they are. I just think that certain types of censorship are so dumb, because people used to pass, like, DVD codes by passing around a color. They're like, here's this color. And numbers can be encoded into the color. But this is a string of 4 digits. This is so basic, you can't even, you might as well censor the word high. You might as well censor HI.
That is the issue, as far as I see it, for this particular story, is that it would lead to such broad-ranging self-censorship.
Precisely.
Because the whole problem here is that if you remove intent from the equation, if you remove context, right, like, why can't we just give Comey the benefit of the doubt that all he meant was what he said he meant, that he just wanted Trump to be impeached? Couldn't he have just said impeach Trump, right? Why couldn't that have been sufficient? Why does this have to be a whole saga built out of these 4 numbers that it seems to be making much more of it than what was the intended, at least as far as, again, as I can tell as a lay observer, what the intended statement was that Comey was trying to make, which was just a sort of silly post about, oh, I found these shells on the beach, and oh, isn't that funny? But the issue arises here of when we're talking about numbers, that numbers can mean dates, and dates can carry a certain significance. So the one I'm thinking of actually is, have you ever seen the movie V for Vendetta?
Yes.
Okay. The specific date, remember, the specific day of November references a specific event, right? And so the issue that arises when you're talking about numbers, or when you're talking about things that have symbolic meaning, is that they can be referring to violent events in the past in a way that can be interpreted as advocating for those things. Now, that's where the big issue arises, is that context always matters. It should matter. Context always matters. That it shouldn't be enough usually to just state. People are historians, right? There's academics. They study these things. How would you ever study something if you can't utter the words? But the point is that actually the quintessential example right now would be 9/11. I can say the words 9/11 referring to a specific day without saying that I'm advocating at all for what happened on those days. No way. Those were terrible tragedies, right? But you're referring to that day as an event in history, right? That it's something we remember because it was a pivotal day in history. Like the same with Pearl Harbor, right? That we remember the day by remembering that it happened, right? And that we should remember that it happened so that we can learn from the lessons of history and move forward, right? That we want to remember, but also as memorials, right? We want to remember those who have lost because their life had meaning, right? That the victims of such a huge tragedy, they were going to work that day, right? They were just any other day, but then it wasn't, right? That's a complicated topic because I was in middle school and they showed it on TV.
Whose class showed it on TV?
Oh, I don't think it was in the class. I think I was out in the cafeteria or something in the hallway.
Oh, they put it on the cafeteria? Man, they were just in the post-90s cultural area. It was just unhinged, man. They put it on the TV
Yeah,
in a middle school.
all I remember was that it was on the TV for a good portion of the day until they decided to stop having the news constantly going in a loop. But it's one of those events that for a whole generation, it defined our entire adult life, right? There were two wars that the entirety of our young,
Yep.
our teenage years and our adult existence was just like constant environment that we had to live with of just this like the constant war and the constant threat of, or not threat, the constant fear, right? That
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm trying to explain it in a way. Like there was a time, the current generation of young people have no idea that there was a time before that day where like it didn't even register when going to the airport or going on a bus or going on a train, traveling.
Yeah.
That like there was the possibility of just extreme sudden violence, right? Yes,
Yeah.
it happened, but there wasn't like that constant.
No, probably wasn't going to happen to you. Like, it didn't even really enter one's mind. Yeah. It was, oh, that's a tragedy, and then you go about your day.
It's like an age of innocence, if you will. But
It was.
it reminds me actually. Do you remember reading? Did you have to read The Magic Mountain about Hans?
I did, but it was so cryptic that I had a hard time following exactly what was going on. But it was good.
In my older age, I now understand a
Yeah.
bit more of what it was trying to say. Is that pre-World War I, right? That there's this sort of camaraderie between
Yeah.
nations. That the civilized world could engage in like the Renaissance and art and music and opera, and it's just life could be lived. But then during World War One and after, the world got split up into serious divisions and extreme violence, right? Like the Battle of the Somme, tens of thousands of people died in an hour, right? If you ever read that particular battle, it was just brutal, right? Of people being gassed and shot and exploding. And sorry, the point is that like war changed, and in changing, it changed societies to become much more violent by the nature of the weapons that were being used. And ever since that point, from World War One onwards, societies have been struggling to figure out a way to rein in the worst excesses of humanity. They haven't succeeded all too often. Look at World War Two as an example. That clearly the efforts after World War One to try and rein in the worst impulses of societies failed. Right? Germany rose to power and committed its atrocities, and then it had to be stopped. Right? And since then, we've had this sort of fragile, I don't know that I'd call it peace, but a fragile impasse between the most powerful countries of the world, where they're they don't want to keep fighting in the ways that we saw for World War II. Like I'm trying to think of any war right since then that's been fought at that scale. There isn't really one. The closest one would be Ukraine versus Russia right now, just because in terms of the numbers of people involved.
Or like the Congolese Civil War or something.
Yeah, and that one's been going on for a very long time. That one's a little strange because it's contained in its own little bubble.
Yeah.
But the Ukraine-Russia war, it has tentacles that span farther than just the borders of Ukraine and Russia, because NATO is constantly being vigilant of getting attacked and then having to step in and fight Russia. Like in terms of where we are closest right now to World War III would be Ukraine, Russia, and then the Iran war. But I don't know if the Iran war is wrapping up or not. But that one had the potential to spiral out of control if the Strait of Hormuz just stayed closed for much longer. It's when we reached actual gas shortages and oil shortages that there was going to be real panic setting in.
Yeah. You mentioned them putting on the 9/11 attacks on 9/11 in the cafeteria TV, and I don't doubt it. But it reminds me actually of in middle school, the vice principal, she would get on the announcements and say these things, and one thing she said, and forgive me, I'm going to be a little bit irreverent here. Well, whatever, I'm an adult now, and we're not in the middle school anymore. You can't write in her voice, but I won't try to imitate it. You can't write, have a great summer, or have a good summer in people's yearbook. Because what's the acronym of that? And then if you change the first letter of that acronym, what is that? What is that?
And she was like, have a great summer. Hags?
And then if you change the first letter, what can you spell?
Oh, that didn't. Oh, I get it, but that didn't occur to me that
She got on the TV announcements and explained this fact to us. Maybe you were gone that day.
I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember.
And I just thought, this is the dumbest thing I have ever heard. This is what people think is sensible to talk about. And then remember this one time when she's like, tolerance. This is about tolerance. And she got a kid who had whatever on the announcements, put him in the chair next to her and said, so what tolerance means is, Billy, I will tolerate you. And I just thought to myself, gosh, I told my family about this, and they're like, that place is kooky. So that's probably why those things were formative experiences for me. And I was like, man, this censorship stuff sucks. I hate it. And so that's probably why I think the way I do to this day. But, like, returning to the original verboten word, or verboten string of digits, people could disseminate that if they shared certain phone numbers.
No, I get what you're saying. And in our age of AI, someone could run some kind of AI query. Oh, I found these series of numbers and words. Clearly, that means that the person's terrible. And it's just, maybe it just found the numbers as part of a phone number or something.
Yeah, this is like the Da Vinci Code, but the Dacomey Code. Anyway, but it does remind me of Nixon and his determination to put the hammer down on political opponents.
If you haven't seen that movie, it's a really good movie for this particular topic, because they were protesting the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War protests were very vocal, right? They were very aggressive. It's understandable, right? It was a very brutal, violent war, and people were being drafted into it. And so you had a counter culture movement to try and stop the Vietnam War, right? That had been going on for a very long time. What better place to protest something than a massive political convention, right? All the people who make the decisions are there.
Yeah. And inasmuch, like, Nixon was impeached in 1974, and I would just say that 1974 is the answer to 1968 in that respect. But I also think about, you know the Apple advertisement with Big Brother talking on the TV, and there's this runner, and she throws the shock put and shatters the TV, and it's like, the Macintosh is coming out, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. But it's 2026, and it's the 250th anniversary, and I'm just thinking to myself, is 2026 going to be like 1984? Not really, because we're talking, so not exactly, but like closer than I would like. And that's the whole point.
Yeah, in that regard, I'd say that it does look like they're trying to memory hole some stuff. So the thing that stood out to me is they're trying to erase any record of January 6th happening. They pardoned most of the January 6ers, and now they're removing any record of the prosecutions happening or people being convicted on government archives or records. And it's okay. Do we just ignore that? This is essentially erasing history, right? Do we just ignore that these things happened entirely? That's what I find very bizarre and surreal about this moment in time, is that essentially they're quietly erasing history, right? So in those national park exhibits where they're trying to remove all the references to slavery or women, or like this was early on in the Trump administration where they had that list that it just sticks with me. They had a list of 100 words that no government agency could mention. And some of the things on that list were really bizarre, like women. And it was just like, what's happening? How did we end up here?
Mike Pence's America. You can't mention women.
Extreme censorship of words. But you're also seeing it happen in the ongoing controversy right now in the Pentagon, with Hegseth intervening and stopping the promotions of like black people and women, right? What's going on there? Why were these people denied promotions? What were the exact reasons under the law that you could even remove their names from the list? Someone's name can't just be removed. There has to be cause. They have to have done something so egregious that they get removed from the promotion consideration. And it's usually stuff like crimes or financial issues or some kind of issue with credibility. Like they directly disregarded an order that they were getting. There has to be a reason. It can't just be this person's a woman or this person's black. Therefore, they don't get promoted, right? Can you imagine spending 20 or 30 or 40 years traveling all over the world, right? Working in all sorts of extreme environments in some cases, like submarines and planes, and in the cold and in the extreme heat, right? Or on a ship. And then you get put on a list for promotion for meritorious service, right? That you were so good at your job that they considered you to be among the best at your job. And then some guy gets appointed to a position. Nope, right? Off the list. Eh, nope, can't get promoted. Why? Merit. That's what he said. That's the statement that the Pentagon's been making. It's like, these people were removed for merit. What's merit to them? What precisely constitutes merit in their eyes? That's what I find very puzzling about this current situation with. Anyways, that's all. Sorry for going on that particular tangent, but that one's been on my mind.
That's why it's called Mondays with Mike.
I know, but it does relate to this issue of censorship. That if it proves true that the motivation to not promote some of them was because they would show up in pictures with Trump at official events, is that really how we should treat people who are seriously endeavoring in their careers to serve this country in a volunteer capacity in the armed forces? They would show up at a funeral or something or some kind of public event in a picture, and it's not made for central casting that have an iron jaw and are 7 feet tall. What is going on here? Have you ever heard the phrase, these are not serious people?
Yeah. Fine then. I guess we'll monitor Comey's case too. He's ended up being something of a lightning rod these past 10 years.
Oh yeah, his saga has been very bizarre, right? He's a cause célèbre now for political opposition. Integrity? Again, what's weird about Comey is he's setting the bar for basic levels of integrity in positions of power where he wouldn't kiss the ring of unquestioning loyalty to the president, and somehow that's the bar that he won't just listen to every whim.
Happy 250th, America. Hopefully we get it together a little better by 260. Or, no, that's for another podcast. What year did I have written down for that one? Let me think about this one. Oh yeah, maybe 2063 or something like that. The refounding of America. That's a complicated part. I'm not going to put that in. Okay, Mondays with Mike.